What's going on, guys? This is Empty Box, and today we're going to be talking about another sim racing title. This time we're kicking off the quote-unquote next generation sims with rFactor 2. Now, as with all three of the next generation sims I'll end up covering, rFactor 2, Project Cars, and Assetto Corsa, this could likely be considered as a constant evolution type of product where things are constantly changing. Heck, you can even also throw in iRacing into that category as well. So, some things will be improved, some things will be changed. Don't take this as a final end-all be-all. You should honestly, look at it as a long-term product because it is a long-term product. rFactor 1 was supported for 4 or 5 years officially, and not to mention the third-party mod community. So, anyways, let's actually start talking things here. Now, there is a couple of things that you should understand with rFactor 2. First of all, it's a long-term evolving product. Right now, it is no longer in beta. That process ended in January. However, I honestly didn't even notice. A lot of the content that they, quote-unquote, officially have out is very, very, very much work in progress. The standards are very, very all over the place. Some cars drive tremendously, such as the Corvette C6R GT2. Some cars are just beyond terrible, like the Formula Renault 3.5. Just, yeah. It's all over the place. They're saying that content will be updated and brought up to standard. However, currently, in its current form, it's not even close. This means that there's a very small selection of content that is actually good. I can think of probably about 3 cars and maybe 3 or 4 tracks. Again, is that a big deal out of the box? Probably not, considering the fact that this is a long-term project. And obviously with third-party modding being supported fully within rFactor 2, that can be easily taken care of. For example, in rFactor 1, I don't think I ever played the default ISI-created content, because there's no reason to. Much like what will probably happen with this sim once we get a couple of years under its belt. However, at this phase, that modding community hasn't really happened. A lot of modders don't understand rFactor 2 because Image Space Incorporated really hasn't helped them understand it as well as they did with rFactor 1, which of course, over 7 years, you do learn a lot of things about the engine itself. So that hasn't happened yet. It will probably happen down the road, but again, with the market that this title is going into, we will see if the modding community actually stays as strong as it was in rFactor 1. Early indications say kind of mixed. There hasn't really been an actual major mod released for rFactor 2 yet, in my opinion. There's been a couple of things that have been pretty good, but they've still been rough around the edges because, again, it's not really understood. And that takes time to develop and takes time to learn. So we'll see how that pays off, how that works out, because obviously modding is absolutely crucial with rFactor, with that whole concept of being an open-ended moddable sim. So I will say, though, that the content that Image Space Incorporated supplies is much better when it is much better. Some cars like the C6R and the Marussia F1 car just drive amazingly. They drive wonderfully. You actually can get into it. For example, I'd honestly say that sometimes this sim knocks my pants off. It's just amazing. Sometimes when you get into that content that isn't so good, it makes me go, can I have my refund, please? This is terrible. It's really two-sided, but again, it's still a work in progress. Like I said, I would still consider this beta, even if they technically want to say, it's not beta. It's beta. It's beta if it's beta. Anyways, so besides modability, what makes rFactor 2 unique in this sim racing landscape? It doesn't really have as strong of a multiplayer as iRacing. Again, League Racing can solve that, but that's a different type of environment altogether. It doesn't necessarily have the best content. Sometimes it's really good, like I mentioned. Sometimes it's really bad. It's all over the place. Those standards will hopefully be raised, and everything that they've released recently has been pretty dang good, and definitely been a lot better than ISI have done in the past with any title, I will say. So kudos for raising your game, ISI. But the one thing that really makes rFactor 2 stand out for me isn't the physics or anything. They're really good when they are really good. But the force feedback in the track. The thing with rFactor 2 is the track feels alive for the first time I've ever experienced in a sim. The force feedback that you get through your wheel is probably the best on the market, and from the sims that are coming up, from what I've played with those, it's gonna be the best. You feel really connected. You feel like the wheel is doing exactly what you expect it to do. It feels solid. It feels well built. They use what's called an unfiltered force feedback, which means that you get more detail coming through. However, because of that, if you have a Logitech wheel, which is gear driven, such as the G25, G27, Driving Force GT, if you go off-road with the filter turned off, which is how it's best enjoyed on the road, it will shake the snot out of your wheel and it'll feel like it's about to explode in your hand. I experienced this with the Driving Force GT, and you really do got to turn the filtering on if you do have one of those wheels. That said, it is still pretty dang good even filtered. Then you also have the dynamic racing line, which is probably the biggest feature. In fact, it just completely changes the dynamic of the track and the racing itself, because now, rather than just being able to pass a guy on the outside, which is usually the dirty line, you actually have to think about it, because if you go out there, you're going to have significantly less grip. Personally, I feel like this effect is a little bit overdone, to the point where a green racetrack, quote-unquote, feels more like a dirty racetrack, such as Albert Park when Formula 1 shows up there at the beginning of the year, where everybody in their Joe Schmo automobiles has been dropping oil and grease everywhere, as opposed to a natural racing circuit, which, probably doesn't see the most use, but sees enough use to at least keep it somewhat clean and everything. But it's still absolutely amazing. It just brings a whole new dynamic to the racing, with having the online grippy line that is grippy as can be. And then if you get outside that groove just one little step, it is completely different. You do not want to miss the apex on a fully rubbered in track, because you will probably go way wide and lose a lot of time, which in most other sims, any other sim actually, that just doesn't happen. Especially for me, liking the long-term endurance racing type of experiences, a rubber track at the end of a 24-hour long race, that's going to be a lot of rubber down. There's going to be a lot of marbles, which are added in as well. It's going to be, you'd want to consider where you're passing and what's actually going on. That is what makes it feel alive, and that's something that no other sim out there will accept to be able to do nearly as well as rFactor 2. Okay, now what about all the things that you interface and deal with within the game? The UI, the sound, the graphics, all that good stuff. Well, the user interface is still lacking compared to some of the other titles that will be available, most notably Assetto Corsa, which again I'll talk about later. Its sound isn't spectacular, and it never has been. In fact, I'd say that pretty much every racing game out there could really improve on their sounds. So I can't really fault them too terribly much, but it sounds like you expect. Not as bad as Gran Turismo, but it's definitely not good. Then there's the graphics, which are very interesting, to say the least. When I watch videos on YouTube, rFactor 2 looks terrible. It looks like it came out of 2005 with rFactor 1. But when I actually play it myself with the steering wheel and get into the game, I feel more immersed than in most other titles. I feel like the graphics are looking better. They're looking more correct when you are actually playing it yourself and you're getting into the sim rather than just watching it, which is something that I can't do justice to, obviously. You have to play it for yourself to experience this type of effect. But, honestly, it looks okay. The trackside replays aren't good. They do need to be improved. Will that be something that will be improved? Hopefully. What about AI? Right now, the AI is, in my opinion, lackluster. It's there, it works, but it isn't even up to the standards of the G-Motor 2 sims that I mentioned previously, most notably Game Stock Car and Formula Truck, if you even want to include that, seeing how that's on the very near horizon in terms of an official release. So, I don't know. It's a really good sim at its core, it just needs more development. What will happen with more development? Again, it's hard to say. Pretty much the same story with all the other sims on the market. It could be amazing. It could completely obsolete everything else because the core features are there, but right now it just doesn't have that finish. It doesn't have that polish. But what will happen with that polish? Could rFactor 2 be the one? that basically destroys any other sim? Maybe, maybe not. So that said, in our next video we're going to be covering another rather flammable topic, Project Cars. Another sim that is in quote-unquote development, although this one is truly in development. In fact, they're saying it's still alpha, pre-alpha, so it's very early in development for that one. That one will also be coming to the consoles, interestingly enough, but we'll talk about that in the next video. So until then, bye.